it was an era where that's where most people got most of their news, and news wasn't instantaneous. News came out every day. There were maybe 7 editions of the news, 12 editions of the Post, a few editions of the Times, but all of this, the cycle and the compression that we live with, it wasn't there. And news was distributed from one place out to everyone, as opposed to the way we also get it now, which is we curate our own news. We're, in a sense, our own editors, which has some pluses and has some minuses.
Joining us now on Open Book is Richard Esposito. He's a 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist. He's also the former NYPD deputy commissioner. So there's a lot to unpack there, as well as the book, Richard. But the title of the book is Jimmy Breslin, The Man Who Told the Truth. And what a fascinating book. And I just want to frame this for you, Richard, before we start the interview. I was 13 when Son of Sam was prowling New York. And of course, you remember those very famous daily news composites. And of course, Jimmy Breslin was on the beat. I don't think there was a person that could read in New York that wasn't reading Jimmy Breslin. So I just want to set the scene. I was young at the time, but it was a riveting part of our lives. But it's great to have you here. What a career you've had. So I want to start with that. Tell us a little bit about your background. Tell us who you are, if you don't mind, because I think we're both fellow Italian Americans. Tell me a little bit about your grandparents, if you don't mind, if you remember them.
Sure, I think I remember them. Yeah, so I was born up in East Harlem, Pleasant Avenue, which was an Italian American neighborhood. And my mother's family had come over from Italy in the late 1920s. My grandfather basically jumped ship and became a laborer in New York. And my father's father was a plumber. And so that's where I started. I grew up in that neighborhood and went to school in Manhattan, went to high school at Fordham Prep in the Bronx, went to NYU. So as you can tell, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere that you couldn't get to by subway.
Yeah, the Italians don't even let you go to summer camp, Richard. You know, there were only the Jews go to summer camp. You know that, right? The Italians are not allowed to go.
My mother said you could go to Columbia, NYU, Fordham, or any place in Queens, and that's it. Right. So I was like, okay, well, that's my choices. So that's my my childhood in Manhattan. It was Manhattan was a different place, big as it was, and I thought I was going to teach. I went out to graduate school at Berkeley, but then I was able to get a job as a copy boy, which is just what it sounds like. You took people's words, their copy, and ran them back and forth. You also shined shoes, bought cigarettes, got people beer so they could get through the day at the Daily News. And, some people go to journalism school, and the old system of being an apprentice where they paid you to learn, which was kind of neat. So that's my beginnings in journalism. I spent 4.5 years at the News. I became a reporter there. And I came just 6 months after Jimmy Breslin got there. I got there as like a 22-year-old clerk. And so that's the beginning of my introduction to him and working. My starting job in journalism was the largest tabloid in the United States. They had.
So I want to go there, if you don't mind, because I have a lot of younger viewers and listeners to this podcast, and they're used to the internet and they're used to reels on Instagram or TikTok. But when we were growing up and when you were rising in your profession, we had the tabloids, and so what was packed inside the tabloids, the sports section. Top stories. They could have been national stories, but also stories that were important to New York City. There was a gossip column. There was even a horoscope. There were cartoons. I mean, this was the end all be all. And I can just say to you, and I think you'll appreciate this, my father had the Daily News delivered every day. I would go out to the front of the house and I'd get it out of its plastic wrapper and I would sit down and I would eat a bowl and maybe even a box of Captain Crunch cereal or a box of Lucky Charms. I'd start from the back, Richard, because that's where the sports section was. And I would go and I would read it backwards, like I was a Talmudic scholar, right? Yeah. I would read the whole thing. And so tell us about that time in New York when the daily news was read by everybody. And the legendary Bill Gallo, the sports cartoonist. Tell us a little bit about the whole thing.
You know, it's in a sense, the book is like, it's a book about a bygone era. When I started, you know, you would go into the Daily News, and if you touched the railing, you got covered with ink. You know, there were these huge presses spitting out 1 million or more copies of paper a day. And as a clerk, you would take bundles of those papers from the composing room, bring them upstairs. And the subways, which, as you know, now are filled with all of us looking at our iPhones, and were filled with people reading tabloids. And the reason for the tabloid was, one, a lot of pictures for working class people who, when the news began, might have had an 8th grade education. 2, very short stories, simple punctuation, quick to read. And 3, you could open it in a crowded subway car. You didn't need elbow room to, like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. So you could hear it almost, people opening and turning the pages. You would read from the back, I would read from the front, somebody else would read the cartoons or the horoscope. And that's how newspapers were sold on newsstands. If you went to a newsstand in New York when we were young, some papers were front page up for people who wanted to buy whatever was on the front page, and other papers were back page up for people who cared about what was really important, whether the Yankees won or the Mets lost. And that's how news dealers would sell them. So it was an era where that's where most people got most of their news. And news wasn't instantaneous. News came out every day. There were maybe 7 editions of the News, 12 editions of the Post, a few editions of the Times. But all of this, the cycle and the compression that we live with, it wasn't there. And news was distributed from one place out to everyone, as opposed to the way we also get it now, which is we curate our own news. We're, in a sense, our own editors, which has some pluses and has some minuses.
So I guess where I want to go, though, is the feeling. Because there was a feeling. I don't know how to describe this to you. Paul Castellano is gunned down in front of Sparks Steakhouse in December of 1985. And the picture on the front page of the Daily News is something that is seared into my brain. I'll never forget it the rest of my life. You can't get that from an iPhone, no. What we were all experiencing. And so you're on your iPhone, I'm on my iPhone. We may be reading totally different things, and we have totally different algorithms feeding us different information. But every single one of us was reading that paper.
That is, in a sense, something we've lost and we haven't regained in our new media and the way we live. Everybody was reading that paper. So Jimmy Breslin was a voice that over 1 million people bought. That means 3 million people every day would see each other and say, "Hey, Anthony, did you read Breslin's column today on Son of Sam? Oh yeah, I read it. What about you? What do you think? Wow, that was something." There was a common conversation, and that was part of that era. Everyone, if you rode a commuter train in the morning, you'd come into Grand Central Station, you could tell where people worked. Some people would have the Wall Street Journal under their arm. Some people would have the New York Times under their arm. Some people would have the Daily News in their hand. And you could tell where everyone worked. And they all had common conversations with large groups of people. And it's not the same. Even today, the New York Times is algorithm driven. So, it's not for people sitting in a room saying, what are we going to put on the front page today? And that's how those big headlines, Ford to City, drop dead, Son of Sam, turn yourself into me. That's how that got written. That's sort of the ethos of people having a common journey to work, a common conversation at work, and the knowledge that all day long you would be talking about these things. It's something you don't get when you have a hybrid work life, right?
Yeah, no question. And I wanted to set that scene for people to really understand who Jimmy Breslin was. So now, if you and I were Dr. Frankenstein and we were going to make a journalist in a laboratory, it would be Jimmy Breslin. Okay, the guy's born in the city that he loves. He's raised in the city. He gets educated here like you, and he becomes literally the go-to journalist on the beat on so many different stories. And he's a polymath. He reads everything. He's probably the best source journalist of that era as well. And people want to talk to him. Even people that he's lighting up in the paper call him to talk to him. So, in your own words, sir, tell us who Jimmy Breslin is.
Jimmy Breslin was your voice. He didn't speak to you, he spoke with you. And that is what made him unique. He had all those skills you just put together, and he could see the world through your eyes. So he understood the problems of a cab driver. His father walked out on his family when he was 10 years old or younger. He understood single mothers. He understood poverty. He lived all of that. And he lived without bills being paid and having, a mom who drank too much. So you had a person who was a brilliant writer. His writing was, in essence, the poetry, like if Yeats was a cabbie. He could write poetry that you would understand, and it was your poetry. He connected with you intimately. So if you're building this Frankenstein, what you had is someone who started at dawn making phone calls, didn't stop until the rest of the world was asleep making phone calls, and sat there all day sweating over every word to be sure you would understand what he thought was most important to you. And Anthony, he was only talking to Anthony. He wasn't talking to a million people. He connected with you. So that's what made him special.
So let me capture something. Let's tell a story that's in your book that is so Breslin. Okay, he writes a story about the JFK assassination, but he interviews the person that dug the president's grave. So take us through that.
So JFK gets killed. It's perhaps the greatest example of what hate can do in a society, right? A president who was hope and change. Everyone goes to Washington. Every reporter who's anything in the country descends on Washington. And they're all going to be there. They're all going to watch the procession down, Pennsylvania Avenue, the horse-drawn hearse, the horse-drawn coffin down the street. Jimmy wants to show you what it feels like to have a president dead. So he goes to the home of the working man while he's having his breakfast, his ham and eggs in the morning, watches him put on his coveralls, watches him go to dig the grave. He's the only reporter there. And he knows this will give you a window into what the death of a president is really like. A man who's making $3 an hour to dig a hole into which essentially America's hope is put. And that's what Jimmy did. He told this story, and it was a story that also changed how storytelling was done in newspapers. This was not your third person, step back, objective narrative. This puts you there. And when Kennedy is going to be buried, the gravedigger will have to wait, just like you would, to go and see that, because there's no room for the guy who dug the grave at the scene of the great grieving. So it is a classic story and a technique that he used over and over again, but never just as a technique. He always used it to a point. There are many examples of it, and that was just one of the things that made him special. He was in New York when Kennedy was assassinated, and he wrote the next day a story that puts you in the emergency room where Kennedy was being operated on. And you read it. He wasn't there, and yet you were there. He reconstructed it in a way that was phenomenal. And this was very new to the way reporting was being done back in 1963.
So the feeling for me about him was that he was the center of the city. You know, the politicians, Andrew Cuomo's father, Mario Cuomo, Ed Koch, Abe Beame, John Lindsay. If you picked an American New York pol, they were talking to Jimmy Breslin. They were part of his web, but also the criminals, Richard. Tell us the story about the Son of Sam and David Berkowitz, and obviously you reached out to him in prison to get some of his commentary related to this.
Yeah, I mean, the criminals knew that this was the guy who would tell their story too. Berkowitz somehow, this serial killer who gone through, came out in the dark of night with a handgun and killed young women. He decided that the person he wanted to tell his story was Jimmy Breslin. So he wrote him a letter, a really dark letter about the streets of New York, and that he would hope to see Jimmy again, or maybe Jimmy would get to watch the cops blow him away. So that's a serial killer reaching out to him. But on another hand, when Frank Costello, who ran the Lucchese crime family, was retired, and 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝘀𝗵𝗏, a mob rat, was in Washington testifying, Jimmy went to tell the 𝗕𝗁𝗁𝗀 testifying story by sitting with this retired gangster while he had his last cup of coffee for the night. And Rossetti turns to him and says to Jimmy, I'm not watching these hearings. My agent said I'm not going to get any residuals from the last one, so why should I participate in this one? And he brings you humor in this case of this mob stoolie taking apart the mob by being able to sit with the gangster who trusted him enough to let him in the room and sit down with him. And he did this repeatedly. He was beat up by Gentleman Jimmy Burke, who ran the Lufthansa's heist of $9 million from the airline. He was once beat up by him, but when his wife had cancer, Burke called Jimmy up and said, come over. Jimmy got in a cab, he went over, and Burke said, here's $35,000. Your wife I've known her since she was a girl. So that was his world. He lived and breathed the entirety from Mario Cuomo, who was both his friend and someone he called and tortured every day, to gangsters. I mean, if you asked Andrew Cuomo, the governor's son, also a governor, he would say Jimmy knew that his father and Jimmy had different jobs, and those jobs for each of them came first.
Yeah.
Mine was to govern. Mine was to tell people whether you were governing well or not.
Yeah. And they had great mutuality, respect for each other. I'm going to throw a name at you, Rich. You remember Donald Manhasset?
Oh, very well.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy wrote one incredible story about him. And just for viewers and listeners, Donald Manhasset was in charge of many different things, but he was in charge of the parking commission, and he had obviously taken some graft and stolen some money from the parking meters and had them in his socks and all kinds of crazy stuff, and ended up getting caught. And prior to trial, he committed suicide. It was a very painful thing, and Breslin wrote about that. And what I loved about the writing related to that, it was both sides of it. It wasn't just a two-dimensional Donald Manhasset. It was some of the things that he did well and how he went astray. And what I loved about Jimmy, at least his writing, I never met him, that's why I was so fascinated by your book, was that he was human. He wrote it from the many facets, from the kaleidoscope of what a human being actually is. Every time you turn the wheel a little bit, you get different colors in somebody's personality. And he wasn't afraid to go there. He wasn't a two-dimensional. So much of the writing today is Richard Esposito good, Anthony Scaramucci bad. Let's turn these people into pancakes and just write about them in this really overbite of stereotype, if you will. He didn't do that. He painted with his typewriter a three-dimensional character. And so why was he able to do that? And I think that's really the title of your book. He's able to tell the truth about things with all of its complexity. Why was he able to do that?
he was, fundamentally, if you think about the people who've written about you and your life and your career, how many of them took the trouble to walk up the steps, knock on your door, walk in the room, and ask you the questions to your face, not at a press conference, just the two of you. And once you do that work, you're seeing a person. You're not seeing Donald Manny's borough president who stole money, type. It's not just a name in a story about corruption. It's a person who you've gone and you've met and you've talked to, and you're able to tell your readers what he ate, where he grew up, who his friends were. One of the things about this particular scandal, and frankly, it's the biggest scandal until the one we've had in New York right now, and where half of the government is again getting subpoenaed, indicted. He knew Donald Manny's, and he knew all of his cronies. And one of the things that upset Breslin about this story was, wait a minute, you guys were stealing all this money from parking meters and I didn't even know? That was the thing that angered him probably the most, is that they pulled it over on him. How dare they, And that's what made him readable. That's why you're laughing, because that's how he wrote it, He wrote it like he had this lawyer, Klein the lawyer. Klein the lawyer was actually a man named Mel Lebetkin, who was deeply involved in this scandal. And that was it. Jimmy couldn't write about Klein the lawyer anymore. He was furious because he lost the character and like the nerve of him. Like Mel, now he was just Mel Lebetkin. So this kind of voice, to make things have richness and dimension, this wonderful ability to be a storyteller, is what he did. So when you read the newspaper day after day or year after year, over that time, in essence, he built a world for you. And if you regularly read that newspaper or the ones he wrote for, you knew his world. So you knew these characters. And even people who didn't like him respected his talent. Even people he went after respected his talent. And that comes from people looking you in the eye,
So there's something about him, though, too, that you write beautifully, that, like you say, he is them, he is their voice, but he also, I mean, I'm thinking of the word chaotic. There's something about him that is chaotic. He almost like lived in chaos, as you write about in the book. Describe that. Like, who was he? And what was his lifestyle like? Who did he interact with?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't have a lifestyle. That's the thing. He was incapable of, he couldn't drive. He couldn't keep track of his money. If he made $200,000, he spent $201,000. His wife spent the day, rubbing cigarette ash into pieces of paper to fake receipts. His bosses were constantly scraping up money for him. What made him such a compelling person to write about was he was larger than life in all these ways. He lived in complete chaos, and he was born in chaos. His father was like an itinerant piano player in bars who walked out, left his mother with so little money that she had a bicycle from Queens to like where she worked at the welfare office. And he almost needed the chaos to write. His first wife, Rosemary, she ran the house. She paid the bills. She told the milkman, we don't have any money. She begged his agent to get him to stop spending more than he had. His second wife, Ronnie Eldridge, who his widow now, Ronnie drove him to the dentist. If he went to the dentist, he would tell you he was having brain surgery. That's how the experience to him was that terrifying. And
I mean, it'd be so much of that old school like way of thinking. Before I flip over to the final element of our podcast, I want to ask you about your favorite article. What was your favorite Jimmy Breslin article?
Now that's a tough one. It's a really tough one. But one of the articles that I really loved, we just talked about two of the famous stories of the Kennedy assassination. There's another story that was far less famous. He stayed another day. Everybody else goes home. He stayed another day, and he told the story of what happens with the people in the permanent government in Washington. how a lobbyist calls a press secretary and says, so look, now that I'm really sorry for your loss, but now that he's gone, you're still going to have that investigation into my industry? And Kennedy's private secretary, smart enough to know she doesn't even have a day to clear out her desk. There's somebody coming in tomorrow morning to take her typewriter and take her desk. He captured the pettiness of that in a way that when you read it, you're like, so that's what happens when the pageantry is over and everyone goes home. This is a story I otherwise. So is it my favorite? Today, it's my favorite story. So that's the way I could put it to you.
But it's elemental to our lives, though, isn't it, Richard?
Yeah.
We're lucky if our grandchildren, some of them remember us, and after that, no one remembers us, and that's it. It just, it's like the way the impressions are on the sand after the tide comes in, listen, our friend Robert Caro writes about the anxiousness of Lyndon Johnson wanting to get into the White House, but not stepping on the young widow, Jackie Kennedy, on the way in, and she knows it. And so she actually goes to live in Averell Harriman's Georgetown townhouse temporarily while she's trying to find her way. It's a stunning dislocation.
It is, and he captures something about Lyndon Johnson that few people. I mean, he actually, underneath his gruffness, his boisterousness, his bullying, there was a decent human being in many ways in there, and he understood this and he tried to work with it. And one of the things Breslin captures is, in a sense, after the death of Bobby Kennedy, after the death of Malcolm X, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson became the high water mark of the civil rights movement. There was no tomorrow, in a sense. That's
it's fascinating. The guy that the Kennedys hated turns out to be the guy that gets their legislative agenda passed.
That's exactly right. And knew even as he was passing it that what he was going to be remembered for was being the guy that got us into the Vietnam War. So
I mean, listen, it's an unbelievable book. We're at the point in the podcast now where I'm going to read out 5 words that my producer and I have selected, and then you respond to it. It's just sort of, I'm going to say the word, you tell me what comes to mind. Say the word investigation. What do you think of?
Digging hard and deep.
Okay. What about the word journalism, which is, I think, different than investigation? But tell me what you think of journalism.
I think of it as reporting, going out and getting the facts. That's what journalism is at its best, reporting what's happening.
All right. So that's a good segue to the third word, truth.
Truth is what Jimmy was all about. Take the facts, don't lose sight of the facts, but build fact after fact after fact to give someone a sense of what was true. And that is the hardest part of the craft.
But it's also, it's amazing because I don't know how to say this. It's like he pissed everybody off with his writing. I don't know how to explain it. Like, if you were on one side of something, you read something favorable about the other side, and you got irritated. You know what I mean? And then he did it the other way, but everybody was forced through. Like, today, we don't even do that anymore. We go to the television channel that reinforces our view, and all they do is chant our view, or we don't have that complexity anymore.
No.
And that's really where the truth is, isn't it, Richard? I think the truth is in that complexity.
It is where the truth. A relative of mine loved Rachel Maddow and said, you work at NBC and you work with her and she's a great reporter. I said, well, no, that's not exactly what she does. No, that is wonderful. I said, no, she's a bishop and you're in her church and she tells you what you believe. And in a sense, that's her silo. She's very good at it and there's a lot of facts.
Listen, I respect and admire her. And then there's a Bill O'Reilly bishop too. Obviously I'm not, a big believer in a lot of stuff that Bill said, but he worked his ass off and presented a point of view, So, but we've lost the complexity of a Breslin. So let's go to my fourth word. I say, it's 2 words, New York.
New York is an amazing place. It's really made of sand, isn't it? I mean, it changes every day, and yet, there's been 8.3 million people living there for decades and decades and decades, and they're always a different 8.3 million people. And a third of them are always people who just got to America. And that's what makes New York the kind of place it is, that energy of, and what else can you say about New York? People think of Wall Street, people think of skyscrapers, but what New York is all of those people and all of those lives. And that's what makes it, there are very few cities like that. Maybe Hong Kong is a city like that, or London perhaps, but New York is just a dream. It's a place where people for generations have wanted to be.
Well, I have a love affair. I have an undying, unconditional love affair for New York. It's the place of my grandparents. They left Italy to come here. None of them had any money. All they had was a dream. This is the American Dream Factory. This is perhaps the most aspirational city in history. If you go back through history and you think about the rise of people in New York and the openness and the willingness to accept different types of people. It's an emerging market. If you look at the different people that are arriving here, and it's probably the most cosmopolitan city in the world. Okay, my last two words, and then I'll let you go. I really do appreciate your time today, Richard. Jimmy Breslin. How would you sum him up? Jimmy Breslin.
Jimmy Breslin. He was the man who told the truth. Jimmy Breslin was a larger than life person who you couldn't make up. And he was, in the words of one of his first editors, also a miserable human being, a great reporter, a talented guy, and he was always miserable.
Well, for me, I admired him from afar, never met him. Read almost every one of his articles, and I got there after getting through Dick Young. Do you remember Dick Young?
Oh yeah, I remember him before he became when he was still a sports writer.
Yeah. Well, remember, if you're a Met fan, the worst day in our history was June 15th, 1977. And him and M. Donald Grant are the two enemies of that story. That's when Tom Seaver was traded to the Cincinnati Reds. So it was quite a crew, of people at the Daily News at that time. I really appreciate you coming on with us today. The title of the book is Jimmy Breslin, The Man Who Told the Truth. It's written by Richard Esposito. And Richard, thank you so much for joining us on Open Book today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.